I did my senior project on the Rohingya crisis, which is occurring in Myanmar. I chose this topic because I would like to work with refugees or those who have been affected by genocides in the future, whether they're coming into this country or coming into other countries. So this topic was just particularly interesting to my future career path. Alright. Okay, so an outline of my presentation, we're going to go over a historical background of Myanmar to help you all understand why we're where we're at today. My research question, literature reviews surrounding international law of genocides, theories and indicators of genocides, and then intervention within genocides. I had a case study for my methodology, so we'll go over that, an analysis of that, and then a discussion and some of my limitations in my study. So a quick background, Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country that is predominantly Buddhist. It has about 58 million people, and of those 58 million people, about 60% identify as Buddhist, and then 15% identify as Muslim. Of that 15%, about a third identify as the Rohingya ethnic minority. They reside right here, which is the Rakhine state that borders the Bay of Bengal, as well as Bangladesh, which is important for later. Myanmar was a British colony, and it had a colonial era from 1885 to 1948. This is really important, and it comes into play when Myanmar has to draft its first constitution, because the British practiced a divide and rule tactic, which basically deepened ethnic identity and deepened religious identity among the citizens of Myanmar. And you see that as they write their constitution, as a lot of the things that they require for you to satisfy to become a citizen require you to be of an indigenous race to Myanmar, which basically means a race that was settled in Myanmar prior to the British coming in. So they had three major constitutional changes that kind of line up with regime changes. The first is in 1974 when they're writing their first constitution. The second is in 1947, excuse me, and then in 1974 and in 2008. And basically what the government has done is gone through and made it impossible for the Rohingya to apply for citizenship, and then has deemed them stateless and deemed them as illegal immigrants in Myanmar. And as a result of this, there have been reports claiming that the military has been raping and murdering those who identify as Rohingya, as well as burning down their villages. And some of this stuff has been dating back to 1974, but some of it has also, or the majority of the conflict has happened since 2016. And about 800,000 to 1 million Rohingya have fled out of Myanmar and gone into neighboring Bangladesh. So these are my research questions that I looked at. Is the crisis in Myanmar considered a genocide based on popular theories and indicators of genocide? Is the crisis in Myanmar a genocide under international law? So this looks at the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and R2P, which is the responsibility to protect or prevent. And then should there be external intervention within Myanmar? If so, by whom? How significant of an intervention, and for how long? I focus a lot more on the first two questions, honestly, than I do the third. The third has been a little more difficult, and I'll explain that why later. So my first literature review is talking about the international law surrounding genocide. This gets to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This is where we get our so well-known definition of genocide that's over there on the right. I feel fairly confident that everybody has at some point heard this definition or been exposed to it, so I'm not going to go through it too much. I'm just kind of going to explain some shortcomings of it. The first being, with this definition, it's extremely difficult to prove intent. So the Genocide Convention states that you have to be able to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt that a group of people or a state are systematically murdering another group of people. It also only includes 4 groups. So it says national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. It does not include those who are persecuted for their sexual orientation, for their gender, and or for their political affiliation, which all do occur. And then that kind of leads us into the responsibility to protect and prevent, which is also known as R2P. This is kind of seen as a step forward from the basic definition of genocide that we have, as this gets more at protecting people while it's occurring and then preventing it from happening, not necessarily dealing with it after it's happened. What the R2P does is it looks at this as an issue of absolute sovereignty. So this idea that a state has sovereignty over its territory, over its people, and that others will not intervene in that. So what this does is it says that a state's job is to protect its people, and if it fails to do that, then that obligation is transferred to the international community. So it gets at state sovereignty as dependent upon protecting your citizens, not state sovereignty as absolute. And then this is a really, really recent development, as in like 2 weeks, in the past 2 weeks. Gambia has recently accused Myanmar of carrying out genocidal acts against the Rohingya minority. This trial is not set to take place until next month, so obviously I don't have a lot of data or research or anything on that because it has not happened yet, but it will take place in the International Court of Justice in the Netherlands, and that is a really good step forward. That means that there will be investigations and maybe there will actually be some answers as to whether or not a genocide did occur. So my next part is theories and indicators. We kind of have agreed upon theories, or some call them stages, causal factors that lead up to genocide. The causal factors and the stages kind of go hand in hand, except the stages not only covers before genocide, during genocide, but also after genocide, and the causal factors are just before the genocide. So the 10 stages can occur simultaneously, may occur out of order, and the most important thing is that at any point except for denial, which is in most of the time happens after the genocide has already been committed, there is something that people can do to prevent the genocide from happening. And then the causal factors, like I said, which go hand in hand with the 10 stages, those include like a segmented society, rapid and profound social change, an exclusive political ideology, a capacity for a state or a group of people to carry out a massive murder, or an international component that can affect scope and length of the genocide process. And we will talk about these more specifically and how they apply to Myanmar a little bit later. And then my literature review surrounding intervention and genocides. The first two are studies, and the last is just a set of obstacles that people face. I included the obstacles because unfortunately that's what I'm seeing the most of, is that we're hitting these obstacles and these barriers when it comes to intervention. So Crane did a study based on military intervention in slowing or stopping ongoing killings and genocides. And he looked at the years that genocides were occurring, and he looked at the severity of the genocides in those years. So how many people are dying and how international military intervention affected that, and found that the most effective form of intervention within a genocide to reduce its severity would be one that directly challenges the perpetrator. And Kaufman and Wood did a study based on third-party interventions and how those affect severity. And they found something that I thought was really interesting. They looked at the number of people killed in genocides and the duration of the intervention. And they found that initially, when you intervene, it makes the violence a lot worse. However, after a year to 2 years, it starts to drop. I had some issues with this study just because in a genocide, you don't really have a year or 2 years to spare. So it didn't seem greatly significant in my eyes. Like in the Rwandan genocide, this wouldn't have been very helpful, but this may have been more helpful in something like the Holocaust that was over a longer period of time. And then finally, obstacles of intervention obstacles to interventions of genocide. These are things like delaying the recognition of the genocide, which we were facing up until Gambia accused Myanmar of genocide. Flawed understanding of the causes of conflict. This is really prominent in ethnic conflicts like in Myanmar, because a lot of people believe it's difficult to understand a conflict that's going on between two ethnicities that only live in one country. So it's difficult for us to understand a deeply rooted conflict. As well as the speed the genocide occurs, the lack of willingness to pay for an intervention. Money's always an issue, as we all know, as well as a poor history of intervention. So if you have intervened in the past and it has not gone over well, you're much less likely to want to do it again in the future. So my methodology was a case study. This is kind of an outline that most of the case studies I looked at followed, so this is the outline that I followed. As we went over a history and a background of the topic, and then they would pull out the issues discovered. Those issues would be my research questions. And then a lot of the case studies I looked at research like what's listed up here, so looking at newspapers, interviews with victims, visiting important sites, and then conducting surveys with the public, and then your findings and your limitations. So here are my questions again, and these are my resources that I would use if I were to look at these questions, specifically the first two. I'll explain satellite imagery a little bit later because it kind of seems obscure compared to the rest. But looking at United Nations reports, Human Rights Watch reports, Amnesty International, the Genocide Watch, all these reputable NGOs who carry out reports on mass atrocities, visiting former Rohingya villages, which obviously is something I would not be able to do, but it would be extremely helpful to the study if I could. Interviews with the Rohingya refugees also would be very difficult. And then I did a lot of looking at other case studies that had ethnic and religious conflict, specifically Rwanda, because it was also an ethnic conflict, much like Myanmar. And this is a satellite imagery. I just wanted to clear this up really quick because, like I said, it kind of seems strange with the others. On the left side is the Rakhine state prior to the conflict, and this is Rohingya villages. I know you might not be able to see it that well, but on the right side, after the conflict began, the military started burning the villages, and we did not know if this was actually happening or not until we were able to look at satellite imagery and then confirm it was happening. So these are the kind of sources I'm having to use, which I will get into my limitations later. But my analysis really quickly. So if I were to carry out this study, I actually think it would be much easier to determine this a genocide based on popular theories than based on international law. Based on the popular theories and the stages, you can see the things like a segmented society. You can see how the social changes have affected the minorities, and there was even a veto by Russia and the United Nations when there was proposed humanitarian, or when they proposed to send humanitarian aid to Myanmar. It was vetoed by China. So as well as the 10 stages, you can kind of line them up with the different acts that have happened in Myanmar. So you're seeing things like classification, which is like Rohingya, and a recognized indigenous race in Myanmar, or things like dehumanization, which a couple months ago the military was caught creating Facebook and Twitter accounts, and they were using them to spread anti-Muslim propaganda. So they were spreading false stories, like a story of a Muslim man raping and murdering a Buddhist woman, just as a form of hate. And then finally, my limitations. So I unfortunately had a lot of them. This conflict is ongoing, which has made it very difficult. The most recent flare-up in violence was in 2016, and a lot of this has happened from then until now. So there just hasn't been a lot of time for people to research this, as well as a lot of the information we're gathering is coming from refugees, and obviously traumatic experiences can alter how you remember things, as well as information by word of mouth isn't always the most reliable source. And Myanmar has blocked all humanitarian investigators from entering the country to look at the Rakhine state and to look at how the Rohingya villages have been changed or decimated or whatever. So there have just been quite a few limitations in my study.